A group of skeptics are meeting in Toronto next month to question the events of 9/11. The meeting comes as thousands are set to gather to remember the lives lost on this, the 10-year anniversary of those attacks. The conspiracy theory meetings are set to take place at Ryerson University, and that's where CTV's Amanda Blitz joins us now. Amanda.
Hi, Jacqueline. That's right. Ryerson University, that's where we are. It's supposed to take place from September 8th to September 11th. You might notice the date. Well, that's got some people concerned. I'm here right now with the organizer of the event, Graham McQueen. So, Graham, why are you having this on September 11th, the 10th anniversary?
Well, I think the 10th anniversary is the appropriate occasion to sum up all the research that's been done over 10 years, which suggests that the story we've been given about 9/11 is not true.
But what do you say to those people who say that it's so insensitive to have it on September 11th, on the 10th year anniversary?
I think the people who find it insensitive are probably people who feel that folks like me are nuts and busybodies with nothing better to do. If that's your perspective, you would see it as insensitive. But if you open up your mind to the possibility that we are actually researchers, in my case, university professor for 30 years, doing my best research on this, and we're trying to determine what happened, why it happened, and who did it, those kinds of questions, and we're saying the official story is wrong. I think if you open your mind to the possibility that we're right, it's not insensitive, it's actually crucial. Why would Canadians want to build their foreign policy and their domestic policy on a lie?
So have you faced any resistance?
Anniversaries are important, and we knew that the 10th anniversary of 9/11 would be important one way or another, whether we did anything or not. And I had some fears about how it would be used. It would be used to promote myth and lie and deception. It might be used to reinvigorate the flagging war on terror. There's always Syria, there's always Iran, and so on left to go. But there's another way that it also could be used that I worried about, and that is to put the whole thing to bed, so to speak, to say, this is now part of history. This is not the present anymore, this is the past. And because it's the past, it'll be in the history books and the kids will read it. That is the official narrative, the lie about 9/11. And I thought, in order to try and prevent that, we've got to have an event on the 10th anniversary which will say, this isn't over, this is just beginning. This is just beginning.
We have gathered here at Ryerson University in Toronto for the international hearings on the events of September 11th, 2001. Everything changed after 9/11. That is a cliche, and perhaps a politically motivated one. However, governmental responses to that day's events have reshaped our world in ways I can only summarize here in the briefest manner. The events of 9/11 have served as a cause or pretext for two major wars, producing incalculable suffering in Iraq and Afghanistan, and increasing instability throughout the Middle East.
In Canada, let us add, there are parallel grounds for public debate and formal hearings. 24 Canadians were among the direct victims of the 9/11 attacks. 6 times that number of Canadian soldiers have died in Afghanistan in the longest running of the 9/11 wars. And the kettling and mass arrests of more than 1,000 peaceful demonstrators at last year's G20 protests in Toronto, while the police made no attempt to interfere with the actions of a disorderly minority, was one sign of the extent to which civil liberties have declined in post-9/11 Canada. The importance of 9/11 as a historic turning point, then, is not in doubt. But much of what happened on that day, in the period leading up to it, and in its immediate aftermath, remains in doubt, in terms most particularly of the agencies and causalities involved in that sequence of events. Our 4-day hearings, then, will thus have a quasi-judicial structure. The presentations of the expert witnesses will be evidence-based rather than speculative. The methodologies involved, whether those of the physical or the social sciences, will be rigorous, and the information that the witnesses present will receive a further critical sifting at the hands of the panelists, both in the questions they put to witnesses and also subsequently in their final report.
We all know what we saw, but we don't know what happened. But scientists have a distinct view of what happened because of their professional backgrounds. And so it's meaningful when you get scientists, architects, engineers, the entire conglomeration of the community that has looked at what we saw and studied it according to the scientific method.
In general, the hearings are intended to bring attention to the most substantial evidence that has accumulated over the last 10 years, evidence that the 9/11 Commission report and the various reports issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology failed to adequately address, which demonstrates that there is a need for a new, independent, and international investigations into the events of 9/11. The hearings are not a new investigation in themselves. The hearings will provide a succinct summary of the strongest evidence that a new investigation is immediately warranted and that the international community cannot abdicate this responsibility any longer. The format and conduct of the hearings will be analogous to, though not exactly the same as, a legal proceeding, a criminal proceeding that is known in the United States as a grand jury hearing. The analogy between the Toronto hearings and a grand jury proceeding is not perfect because there are some differences in format and product of the Toronto hearings. The hearings are not being conducted according to any specific laws or legal procedures, and the outcome will not have the force of law. Instead of convening a traditional jury panel, we decided to gather together an international panel of prominent individuals who have agreed to do what governments and major media outlets around the world have so far refused to do: look at the evidence objectively and decide whether it deserves wider attention. In selecting panelists, we looked for two qualifications in an individual: someone who is, one, highly credible, and two, open to objectively assessing the evidence.
Ferdinando Imposamato is the honorary president of the Supreme Court of Italy. As a former senior investigative judge, he presided over major terrorism-related cases, including political assassination. A former senator who served on the Anti-Mafia Commission in 3 administrations, a former legal consultant to the United Nations on drug trafficking, and the author or co-author of 7 books on international terrorism, state corruption, and related matters. He is also a Grand Officer of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Italy. Herbert Jenkins, a Professor Emeritus of Psychology at McMaster University, worked in major research laboratories before coming to McMaster in 1963, an influential figure both in the psychology of learning and judgment, and also in the development of new forms of interdisciplinary curricula that have been widely imitated in other Canadian universities. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by McMaster University in 2009 in recognition of his impact in both fields. David Johnson is a Professor Emeritus of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Tennessee. A Fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners, he served on the staffs of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, the Washington National Capital Planning Commission, and the Regional Plan Association of New York. A former chair of the planning departments at Syracuse University and at Ball State University, he is also a past president of the Fulbright Association of the United States. Richard B. Lee, our 4th panelist, is a distinguished professor emeritus of anthropology at the University of Toronto, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a foreign associate of the National Academy of Sciences. He has served as president of the Canadian Anthropology Society and the Canadian Ethnology Society, and holds honorary doctorates from the University of Fairbanks, Alaska, and the University of Guelph.
Over the course of 4 days, the panel will listen to evidence that has been collected over the last 10 years that contradicts the official government version of events. Each witness will present an opening statement and then answer questions posed by the panel. The panel has been given considerable latitude in the subject and nature of the questions they may ask, and we expect the witnesses to answer every question to the best of their knowledge. After the hearings have adjourned on the 4th day, the panel will reconvene over the following weeks and months and make a decision on which aspects, if any, of the evidence presented deserves further investigation by governments with subpoena and political power. The panel will then publish a final report, which I will help draft and edit, setting forth a recitation of the evidence presented and the panel's conclusions regarding the strength of the evidence and recommendations on how to proceed.
The information that we receive from really all sorts of media, with the exception of the alternate media, the internet, seems to be just kind of telling us the same story over and over again, but they really can't address the hard questions that are out there. They will say, they being those that support the official story, that, well, all those questions have been answered. There's books out there. Well, they've all been answered. Surely they've all been answered. But when you read those books and when you get into those questions, you find that they have not been answered.
This is what we're talking about at the Toronto hearings, presenting this evidence to the distinguished panel and packaging it. And I'm very excited to be a part of it and to hear the other distinguished panelists discuss the other aspects of the extremely explosive destruction of the Twin Towers, including nanothermite composite explosives found in all the World Trade Center dust.
People that read this material and have looked into it realize the official account can't withstand scrutiny. It's just full of holes and contradictions, gaps. The difficulty is bringing this to the attention of responsible parties. The political class in the United States is basically, you can't talk about it, much less do anything about it. And so I think bringing it to Canada and bringing everybody together and trying to put on the table a collection of evidence that we are confident about can raise the profile of this issue, because that's all we have to do is get people to take a look at it.
So I've been interviewed a lot, especially recently in connection with the hearings, and the media have been told, I suppose, for 10 years that conspiracy theory is the term to use, and that's why we don't interview these people much, and that's how we're going to disparage them when we do interview them. It hasn't worked very well for them recently, because if that's what you've done for 10 years, instead of looking into it, instead of thinking about it, the most you've been able to come up with is the term conspiracy theory, then when you're finally confronted with a whole bunch of articulate, intelligent people together, and they just dismiss that as BS. What do you mean conspiracy theory? Let's talk about it. Then it turns out you don't know anything. You don't have anything else to say. So one interviewer after another, I find, has been speechless once you explain that the conspiracy theory label is useless. They have nothing else to say.
Conspiracy theory is a way of trying to discredit inquiry. I mean, it's perfectly legitimate to say, here is a very, very serious event that occurred. It killed thousands of people right off the bat. It's killing firefighters still today. It's used to justify war. It's killed thousands of American soldiers. It's killed millions of Iraqis and Afghanis. It's literally in the millions. And to consider that investigating the roots of that is somehow not legitimate, or that you have to be somehow psychologically impaired, some sort of conspiratorial thinking. They're trying to psychologize all this to where people can dismiss people who even ask these questions. I think it's being a responsible citizen to ask questions of your government and to not just take what they say without any kind of critical thought.
That's only half of it. We're crazy nuts who don't know our feet from our hands, and we're very dangerous. So much so that they have at least 2 officers inside the U.S. government to deal with conspiracy theorists. This is Orwellian thought control. The government is in the business of telling people not to listen to conspiracy theorists.
They can't answer the physics, they can't answer the questions, so what else can they do? When you're getting difficult questions, of course, you just smear the person that's asking those questions if you can't answer those questions head on. And I think the nice thing about these international hearings today is that anybody who looks at it will realize that we're not walking in there with tinfoil hats. We are just normal people. We are ordinary citizens who are concerned and trying to do something about it. We are not irrational people. We are bringing up legitimate questions that just cannot or have not been answered.
We're putting our reputations on the line, speaking publicly about an unpopular subject. And all we're asking is that we be taken seriously and that the evidence be looked at.
I think we face an uphill battle in our effort to establish a real inquiry into the horrific events of 9/11. And a necessary part of that battle was advanced in our 4 days of hearings. We have focused on the strongest evidence and reasoned arguments that the official account of 9/11 is not true. Any open-minded person, in my view, who genuinely seeks the truth and is willing to examine the evidence would support a real inquiry with the power to subpoena witnesses and with the political clout to pry loose from a secretive government evidence that they have so far managed to suppress. We really want to begin a long process of rebuilding trust in the democratic state in the only way it can be done within the law, by opening the government to the legitimate needs of its citizens to know and to see and to be heard. We should be a movement to rebuild trust through real inquiry. To bring about a rebirth of democracy and trust in the United States, this must be done in and by the people and some part of the state together.
It occurred to me, as I tried to put forward to the questioners in the last couple of days, that because of the collapse of these three towers, there must be massive changes to the building codes in the United States of America, and I'm kind of willing to bet that there aren't any. And I kind of think that that is something that we definitely should definitely be explored. Why aren't there changes in the building codes? The towers collapsed. According to the recognized authorities, this is how they collapse. So what's happening in the building codes? One of the rhetorical devices used by the official story is to say that we critics are showing disrespect for the dead. And on the contrary, it seems really important to say that by really seeking the true sources of their tragedy, of their deaths, we are showing real respect for them and not crying crocodile tears.
The panel decided to present a formal charge to the General Prosecutor of the United States and the Prosecutor of New York City against the unknown responsible of the above indicated action further than crash of airplanes. And to this regard, the Toronto hearing panel asked for further technical and scientific investigation by independent and impartial expert appointed by competent USA magistrate in the respect of the rules of due process of law. This panel trusts the USA United States justice and in United States willingness to accept the truth. Nevertheless, if the inert and careless behavior should continue, we would be obliged to start legal proceedings before the International Criminal Court of Hague, according to Article 7 of the Court Statute. This article establishes the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court for the crimes against humanity as the 9th event of September. The International Criminal Court has been established in order to watch over the world people against the crimes committed out of the declared wars. It is not a question of interference, but of justice and solidarity.
I want to say that I am a proud and patriotic American U.S. citizen. I served in the military. I've been a federal employee. I've represented the United States as a Fulbright scholar in 4 countries. And I think my country has a proud history, not all of it, but much of it, and we've done some wonderful things, and I have not given up on my country. I was at the original hearings when the Twin Towers were proposed in New York as a city planner in 1960, I think it was 67 or 68. And I supported the building of the Twin Towers proposed by David Rockefeller to keep the financial district in the downtown. It was migrating north, and that's why it was built. I supported it because I felt it made good planning sense, and there was I was well aware of the internal structure of this building. A very interesting structure, unique actually. I had done work in structural engineering. My first degree was in architecture. And so when I saw the videos of the collapse of the building, I said, something's fishy here. And this was in 2002. It was very early. And I talked to people about it, and they looked at me and rolled their eyes, as they do. Senator Fulbright, who was one of my heroes, he wrote in a book called The Arrogance of Power, I do not think for a moment that America, with her deeply rooted democratic traditions, is likely to embark upon a campaign to dominate the world in the manner of a Hitler or Napoleon. What I do fear is that she may be drifting into commitments which, though generous and benevolent in intent, are so far-reaching as to exceed even America's great capacities. At the same time, it is my hope, and I emphasize it because it underlies all of the criticisms and proposals I make here, that America will escape those fatal temptations of power which have ruined other great nations, and will instead confine herself to doing only that good in the world which she can do, both by direct effort and by the force of her own example. Fulbright went on to write another book which he titled The Price of Empire. And in it he said, the price of empire is America's soul, and that is too high a price. Thank you.
We are gathering together to demand a real investigation that accounts for all of this evidence, that uses the scientific method relative to its examination, that uses immunity to bring forth witnesses, and takes testimony under oath. That'll be a real investigation, and we don't know who is capable of performing that yet. That's beyond our area of expertise. But we hope the Toronto hearings will aid us toward that end.
I look forward to the day that there can be a real, legitimate, transparent, independent court review of the information that is being put forward at this tribunal and the work of others who have done the necessary investigations.
There's a lot of people that are easily manipulated because all they basically have is a stereotypical value system that's dished out by the media.
The average person goes to their newspaper and reads their local magazine and listens to their news. It's very hard to get people to break a habit that's been inbred in them for the last, well, ever since they were born. So it's a difficult task. I think the alternate media, the internet, is an absolute critical part of this whole thing.
I mean, the news shows are a farce. Don't get your news from TV. Turn off your TV, get your news from other sources.
I believe in human curiosity and human intelligence, and there's a limit to how long people can go on thinking that one bullet inflicted 7 wounds on 2 different people in the presidential car in Dallas in 1963. That sort of thing slowly becomes ridiculous because of what's being called paradigm shift. It's not that you persuade the older generation die. And then you have a new generation whose minds have not been distorted by the propaganda campaigns.
Would you have any advice for, say, a young person who is inspired, hungry for truth, and looking to make a difference?
Yeah, I would just, watch the people that seem to be making a difference today. There are alternative journalists out there, if that's what you're interested in, if that's what your talents lie, where your talents lie. That's an incredibly important part. We frankly it appears, need to build a new media. It's critically important for the future. So we need people to have the courage and take the steps necessary, make the sacrifices necessary to build that media, take the risks. And if that happens, I think that we're going to make a lot of progress in the future.
Well, I guess the first thing is think for yourself. You know, don't believe something because Peter Dale Scott said it, and certainly don't believe something because the New York Times said it, but trust in your own ability, not just to understand what has been said so far, but if you have the curiosity, go a little further, get into the primary records and discover something new that nobody else has ever discovered before. That's relatively easy to do in this field because there's so much pressure on people not to conduct this kind of research, that if you become independent and do it, you may find something which will contribute to the record.
You need to wake up. You need to look at what's really going on, not just the myth, the propaganda.
I guess if I was speaking to young people right now, I'd say your youth, your physical youth, is a transient thing. We barely get a chance to realize we're young when we look in the mirror and realize we're not young anymore. So, you know, enjoy your youth, but that's not gonna do it for you in your life. You've got to come up with something that's more substantial. And please don't buy into all the stuff about your career and that's the biggest thing in life. You know, truth is important, goodness is important, compassion is important, helping this planet is important, and don't hesitate to give your life to that, your energy to that.
When I ponder the horrendous crimes of 9/11, I likewise feel sick to my stomach. It's a different sickness, but every bit as much vertigo-inducing, as has been given testament here. Human consciousness eventually assimilated the pertinence of gravity and made peace with what it meant, once a heresy against ultimate authority, although it was, and we moved on. Institutions were erected that one way or another gave testament to the witness of science about gravity. And have no mistake about it, we have given witness to science here these last few days. Each of these witnesses, with a score of others doing likewise here, stepped from privileged place into the auger of history. Like Galileo, they glimpsed the redemption that God, him, her, itself, willing, others might someday do likewise, made the mysteries explicable to us all. But when the mass media and every other institution of the land are willing to play along with contempt for laws of the universe, we've got more fundamental problems. In the late Middle Ages, so-called scholastic philosophers confronted with mounting evidence for a world governed some other way than had for so long been accepted, preoccupied themselves with the relevance of angels dancing on pinheads, as if that was the most relevant consideration for them to sort through. I'd like to take solace in some positive headlines in the next few days, glimpse some sort of confirmation that the beautifully shameless testaments made here have made it past the matrix sentinels for the time being. I know that headlines will never be enough. I think all of us know that. But one thing I know for certain, although so many of them want free people thinking otherwise, we who are free are not lone wolves, not now and not ever. Something other than physical laws binds us together now, us who gave witness to these testaments here, so wonderfully done. We might be exiles from the matrix of received wisdom from a pliant media, but as Morpheus in the film story The Matrix said, we are still here. Here's to hoping soon for a world full of exiles. Thank you.
So how did the Twin Towers fall? How did the Twin Towers fall? It sounds like a very easy question, but in fact it's kind of a tough question, because if you ask almost anybody on the street, if you had asked me 4 years ago, I would have said, oh, the planes hit and fires, and I think I heard some about explosions, but that didn't happen, and then they just fell down. But I really didn't understand how those towers fell. And I think if you ask the average person on the street that same question, they won't really clearly understand the official story of how those towers fell. But knowing how those towers fell is critical, because it's like if somebody was murdered, if they were murdered, that's one thing. If they died of natural causes, it's another. We need to understand how those towers fall before we can go find out who did it. Okay, what about thermate? What about thermate? Can thermitic material cut or melt steel? First of all, what is thermate or thermite or thermitic material? I had never heard of thermite before 3 years ago, ever. Thermite is a mixture of iron oxide and aluminum. And when you add sulfur to it, they call it thermate. It's got that sulfur right in it. And so I decided to do a little research on thermite and to find out what it could or could not do. Maybe I can do some sort of experiment. Let's see if they're right. Let's see if thermitic material can cut steel. They come out and they basically say it can't cut steel. Let's see if it can. And I put a little video out on the thing. Here's the initial setup of my experiment.
Using the same beam from my eutectic steel video and another 12-inch beam, I proceeded to make a double-angle welded connection, which I set up on some 8-inch concrete slabs. I could not obtain nanothermite, so I made small quantities of old-fashioned thermate, which is not considered an explosive, with ingredients that are legal and readily available. Thermate is difficult to ignite. An ordinary fuse is not hot enough, but a magnesium strip, which burns white hot, will ignite the thermate, giving off heat and white smoke. In addition to giving off heat and white smoke, thermate produces lots of small spheres of iron. These iron spheres are a natural byproduct of thermate and not from any steel, just like those iron spheres found all through the dust.
So that's the first thing I learned, is that thermate, those little round spheres, is a natural byproduct of that thermate. Okay, so then I thought, well, how am I going to melt steel? How am I going to hold it against any steel? If it melts steel, it's going to melt whatever I press against it. So I started thinking about fire brick. And I finally decided, well, maybe I will get some roof tile we have in Florida and cut it in half, put the loose thermate in there, wrap it around with some plastic wrap, and then I was thinking, well, how can I hold that against a steel beam? You can't bolt tile to a steel beam, so I decided to use some magnets and a spring tooth. And I thought, well, if I do this, I'll put 5 pounds on each side of this. Surely it'll melt that thing. It'll just take it right apart. Well, unfortunately in life, nature's not that way. Nature really doesn't care who you are. Nature's going to do what it's going to do, and it's going to prove what's true for that particular setup. So here's my first attempt. There's the clay tile. There's 5 pounds here and 5 pounds on the other side. There's some magnets and a spring tooth there. I went up to it and lit this thing, and I thought, well, here we go. I'm going to prove it. And I basically proved that it didn't do a thing, except for, I think it singed my eyebrows. I did prove that. As they say, if first you don't succeed, I decided to keep on going. I had to scratch my head a while, and I thought, well, that's strange. It didn't do anything. It didn't do what I thought it would do. So I tried again. Now, when you play this video, I'm going to be talking over it, but as I burn through this column, I want you to, if you can catch it in time, you're going to notice some molten metal pouring down as I go through this. It's fast, but if you slow it down, and you can check it out on the video I gave you in the presentation there, it will create molten metal, and that molten metal looks very similar to what's coming out of the South Tower.
But the steel did not melt, meaning that perhaps a container could be made out of steel after all. Using an ordinary steel box tube, I had a slot milled along one edge. Welding the bottom and using clamps on the top to hold the powdered thermate in, I bolted it to a steel beam vertically. I called this device my thermitic box cutter. With only 1.5 pounds of thermate, or less than 1/100th of what the National Geographic experts used for their experiment, not only was I able to melt steel, but it also sliced a vertical cut. So I made a slightly larger thermitic box cutter. and used 2 3/8 bolts drilled and tapped on one side of the connection.
Here's the molten steel coming out. You dripping out?
It only took a slight twist to break it completely off. I noticed as the thermate burned, it tended to lose its cutting power, perhaps because it could expand into the area where the box cutter previously burned. So I built a piston-driven box cutter using a compressed car hatch piston. I added sheets of tungsten to minimize the burnout and allow the piston to slide better. I then bolted my contraption to the flange of the column and ignited the white-hot magnesium. It appears that not only can thermate melt steel, but it can also cut vertical columns.
So that was my second test. And that one worked a little bit better through experimentation.
Rather than using a mechanical piston to maintain volume, I segmented my box cutter with steel plates, hoping to get a more uniform burn, but got some unexpected results. Can thermate make pressure pulses and/or dust puffs? I guess it can. But why waste all that thermate and energy cutting the columns? Why not attack the weakest areas instead? Can thermate cut bolts? I guess it can. But what if just the head of the bolt is exposed rather than the nut and the threads? Can thermate be configured to cut just the bolt head? I guess it can. And without any evidence on the other side. I don't think that something like my piston-driven box cutter was bolted to the office walls, or trash bags full of thermite used. It's more likely that any pre-weakening thermitic material were hidden inside the perimeter box columns. I had a replica of a segment of the WTC box columns made up. And like the Trade Center iron workers, I bolted the segments together. It made 2 sets of my 2 bolt blasters, placing them in the access hole. Let's listen to another eyewitness.
Like, it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
Is it even possible that thermate could do this? I guess it is. I made a 4-sided internal box cutter that was split into 2 pieces so they could be inserted inside the column. Let's see what happens. I think my box cutter blew about 50 feet up, consuming valuable energy and trimming my trees in the process. Nevertheless, the inside of the column was cut about 3/4 of the way through. Were thermitic devices or maybe explosive nanothermite sprayed inside those box columns? I'm not sure.
And I'm not sure. I'm just saying what thermite can and cannot do. So again, remember the National Geographic experts and all the experts out there asked us this question.
Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams?
Using your power of observation, what do you think? Do you think it can, even though the experts said it could not be done? Unfortunately, there's another little quote out there. In these days, when a man who says a thing cannot be done is quite apt to be interrupted by some idiot doing it. Because we know that regardless of how beautiful their theory may appear, if it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. Thank you.
Today, I'm going to present evidence related to the existence of unusually high temperatures at the World Trade Center, both during the destruction of the 3 buildings and afterward for several months. Much of the evidence presented here will be taken from 2 peer-reviewed scientific papers. One of these papers is called Extremely High Temperatures During the World Trade Center Destruction. The authors include 4 PhD physicists, 1 PhD chemist, and several others, including myself. The second of the 2 papers I'll discuss is called Environmental Anomalies at the World Trade Center, Evidence for Energetic Materials. I'd like to begin with the first of these papers and ask you to notice the maximum temperatures that were cited by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, at the World Trade Center. NIST reported gas temperatures as high as 1,000 degrees Celsius within its report on the World Trade Center destruction. It's important to note that these are gas temperatures, not the temperatures of solid materials. But one problem with the maximum temperatures cited by officials is that there are many eyewitnesses who claim that metal had been melted at the World Trade Center, and we know that could not have resulted from these temperatures. Here are just a few of the eyewitness statements that were made. The first one is from a man who worked for John Skilling, the design engineer of the World Trade Center towers. He said, "As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. A chaplain at Ground Zero said, I talked to many contractors, and they said they actually saw molten metal trapped. Beams had just totally been melted because of the heat." Dr. Keith Eaton of the Institute of Structural Engineers said, "I was shown slides of molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event." Another doctor from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health said in some pockets now being uncovered, they're finding molten steel.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was
Like lava.
from a volcano.
But on the left here, you see molten metal pouring from the South Tower and being pulled from the debris pile at Ground Zero, the World Trade Center site. NIST said that they found no evidence of molten metal. But NIST said if molten metal had been present, it would have had to have been aluminum from the plane. This was not the case, as one can see from these photographs. On the right, you see the difference between molten iron or steel, which is yellow-orange, and molten aluminum, which is silvery gray when poured in the daylight. The temperature required to melt steel is 1,538 degrees Celsius, and it's far above the maximum gas temperature cited in the official report. So the solid temperature, evidence for solid temperatures, are much higher than what officials say the gas temperatures were. In a structural fire, steel temperatures lag behind gas temperatures for a number of reasons, including the thermal conductivity of steel, the effects of convection, and the fireproofing that's applied. Achieving a steel temperature of 1,538 degrees Celsius at the World Trade Center would require gas temperatures that are well above 1,538 degrees Celsius and far above the maximum of 1,000 degrees Celsius cited in the official U.S. government World Trade Center reports. This and other indications demonstrate that the NIST reports do not address the evidence. I've seen evidence of the previously molten metal myself in the form of metallic microspheres that I've found in nearly all the nearly dozen World Trade Center dust samples that I've examined. Here are photomicrographs that I took of the first examples that I received in 2007. And we extract particles from the samples of World Trade Center dust. After realizing that such findings could be used in a legal proceeding at some point in the future, we began asking that samples collected by these independent sources be accompanied by documentation that recorded the date, time, and other necessary information, including sample location. Each sample was provided with this information, as well as the signature of the collector and sometimes a witness as well. The process evolved into the use of a standard chain of custody form, which I've used for many years myself as a laboratory manager. I've extracted the metallic microspheres and other paramagnetic particles from the dust in several ways. On the left here, you can see what the content of a typical World Trade Center dust sample looks like under a microscope. These photos are at 100x. On the right are photomicrographs of particles that were extracted with a magnet from the bulk of the same World Trade Center dust sample. At the top of that, you can see the many metallic-looking microspheres and other droplet-shaped metallic particles. Below that are examples of red chip-like materials and other metal-looking objects. If we look at the first of the two peer-reviewed scientific papers I mentioned, it begins with a discussion of these metallic microspheres, as well as the finding of semi-transparent silicate-rich microspheres. The paper addresses two independently collected samples that were received for this study. Both samples were collected indoors and shortly after September 11, 2001. One sample was collected on an indoor windowsill on September 14, 2001, just 3 days after the disaster, while search for survivors was going on, and in a building 4 blocks from ground zero. The other sample was acquired inside a 4th-floor apartment whose upper windows broke during the World Trade Center collapse a few days later. How were such microspheres formed? As with water falling or spraying through the air, molten metal forms spheres due to surface tension. When a liquid is falling or sprayed through the air, the molecules at the surface do not have other like molecules all around them, and consequently they cohere more strongly to each other, those directly associated on the surface. The United States Geological Survey found the same iron and silicate spheres throughout the World Trade Center dust and could not find an explanation. Our paper explains that the spheres indicate not only that the iron or silicate was molten at one point, but that due to the small size of the spheres, a violent disturbance of some kind would have been necessary to shatter the molten metal into the small sizes seen. Various explosive or incendiary processes are likely explanations. Our research team, led by Dr. Stephen Jones and Dr. Jeffrey Farrar at Brigham Young University, analyzed the metallic microspheres we found in World Trade Center dust by a technique called X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, or XEDS. This is a technique that provided the elemental composition of the spheres. In other words, it told us what elements the spheres were composed of. The result was that the spheres we found were very high in iron and low in other elements. This agreed with the findings of the R.J. Lee group. You can see the trace in the lower section on the left from R.J. Lee and how it matches with the trace on the right from our team. The temperatures required to explain this evidence, listed here, cannot be explained by the temperatures given in the official reports on the World Trade Center. To provide even more corroboration for these findings, we need only look to the official U.S. government report that preceded the current one published by NIST. The first report was from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. Appendix C of their report provided strong evidence of extremely high temperatures at the World Trade Center in the form of highly corroded and eroded steel samples saved from the buildings after they were destroyed. FEMA described samples of steel that had been thinned to razor sharpness. In some cases, there were inexplicable holes in the steel. The fire engineering professors who found the samples could not come up with an explanation for it. They also could not explain the sulfidation of the steel. That is, steel had been chemically changed at the microstructural level in ways that indicated a chemical eutectic mixture had been achieved between sulfur, iron, and oxygen, causing steel to melt. Other evidence for extremely high temperatures at the World Trade Center site include the finding of fused metal and concrete artifacts, like the meteorite, as it's called. This is a mass of molten steel and concrete found at the site, all fused into one big chunk. It also includes the thermal hotspots measured by NASA remote sensing instruments that measure temperature via electromagnetic radiation emitted from the surface. Surface temperatures in the debris piles were found to be as high as 750 degrees Celsius a week after 9/11. As you've heard already today, there's an explanation for all this officially unexplained evidence. This explanation is that the thermite reaction was present and occurring at the World Trade Center on 9/11 and afterward in the pile at the World Trade Center site. The thermite reaction is an extremely exothermic chemical reaction between aluminum powder and a metal oxide. The metal oxide is typically iron oxide, which you can see here on the left with a reddish color. The temperature at which thermite burns approaches 3,000 degrees Celsius for some mixtures, which would explain the evidence discussed so far in this testimony. The products of an aluminum iron oxide thermite mixture are molten iron and aluminum oxide, which quickly forms a white dust cloud as it cools. Additives like sulfur improve the burn properties of thermite. And again, a sulfur-containing thermite, which is called thermate, as Mr. Cole mentioned, would explain the evidence found by the FEMA investigators. I've made nanothermite myself via formulations published by the U.S. National Laboratories. On the left here, you see a photomicrograph I took of a particle extracted from the World Trade Center dust. On the right is a photomicrograph of a nanothermite material that I made. And below that's a photo of the ignition of that nanothermite. And I'd like to show you again a short video. But basically, nanothermite is a solution-made thermite. It's iron chloride dissolved in organic solvents. We add a propylene oxide scavenger material, which turns that into iron oxide. And then you can add organic compounds to this solution. And the important thing is that the organic compounds generate gas when the material is ignited. That does pressure volume work and makes it explosive, generates gas. Of course, aluminum is added as well. If we take just a couple grams of this nanothermite and put it in a smaller beaker on a hot plate and raise the hot plate to its maximum temperature, which is 550 degrees Celsius, this should cause the material to ignite. We'll add a loose lid to the beaker to demonstrate the pressure volume work effects that the expanding gas should produce. Even with this very small quantity, it should ignite rapidly and cause explosive gas effects that can be seen. Let's look at it again. As expected, we did see rapid ignition, less than a second to ignite at all, and rapid gas expansion. When we look, this is an important point, when we look at the ignition residues, they're strikingly similar to the appearance of the World Trade Center dust particles that were extracted with a magnet from the bag. Both are the same colors, they show the same metallic microspheres, and both exhibit the same kind of vesicular formations that suggest high temperature reactions or explosive effects. There was a huge dust cloud that arose from the destruction of the buildings. Again, you've heard about this. It was similar to that of a volcano. In other words, it was a pyroclastic-like cloud and appeared to be driven, therefore, by energy sources that exceeded the energy available from the gravitational collapse. Another striking fact is that the dust cloud was very hot and was burning people and setting objects on fire. Here are photos of the many vehicles that were set on fire or burned in the area. There were also many witnesses to the cloud being very hot and burning people as it passed by. Includes Thomas Spinard from the New York Fire Department said the dust cloud hit us, it got real hot, it felt like it was going to light up. Another man said a hot solid black wave of heat threw him down the block. Another said a hot billowing cloud of death chased us through the narrow streets of lower Manhattan. In conclusion, I think this is the evidence that needs to be considered. There are photographs and witness testimony of molten metal at the World Trade Center. This cannot be explained by the temperatures given by the official reports. There clearly were extremely high temperatures evidenced by metallic and other microspheres, evaporated metal, and silicates in the World Trade Center dust. FEMA reported findings of eroded steel and sulfidation, which have not been explained officially. NASA provided images of high surface temperatures, again not explained. Fires could not be put out at the World Trade Center site. There were unusual spikes in volatile organic chemical emissions, suggesting abrupt, violent fires on specific dates, and unusual species in the environmental monitoring data also corresponding to specific dates, suggesting the presence of thermitic materials. There were high temperature problems noted by the University of California Davis team, and there are similarities, again, throughout all of this to products of thermate and nanothermite. These vehicles were burned as if something passing through the cloud was setting them on fire, and there are many eyewitness testimonies to a hot wind and cloud. So thank you.
Thank you.